the start of the week was quite jolly in the House of Lords this week, which you might be surprised by. The new people who've been nominated to the Lords, people like Dan Hannan, businessman Peter Cruddas, very controversial, even more controversial than me going in, were entered into the Lords, and with Peter Cruddas, who I've never met before, or I'd heard of, he was introduced by Gisela Stewart, and there was another former MP who's a Brexiteer. And at one point we were all gathered round, and it felt a bit of Brexiteer solidarity occurring, which I can assure you in the Lords is an unusual matter. And it really did feel nice to have a few colleagues in arms who understood the importance of why we'd left the European Union, but also who'd been through the mill for having put their head above the parapet. It was an interesting moment because there's been a number of debates about the Lords being stuffed full of cronies and Brexiteers. And it does make me laugh at the lack of self-knowledge from the people in the House of Lords, that they think this is what's going to discredit it. And it's about the only thing that you can say reflects the nation or has any connection with the nation is that there might be a few leavers in there, in view of the fact that was the majority of people who voted in 2016. But they seem to imagine that they're respectable and everybody else is a crony or somehow discredited by their leave status. Anyway, I quite enjoyed it. Obviously, Brexit has been very much at the fore during the last week since I've reported back, and that is a preoccupation. There's a question today about Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland in particular has proven to be, as people anticipated, a thorn in the side of the Brexit deal. And I just want to say a couple of things about that. The one thing is that the reason why Northern Ireland hit the papers was because you'll notice that Ursula von der Leyen and the EU rescinded on Article 16 in a bout of EU protectionism, in which they showed that they didn't give a damn about Ireland and that they'd only ever used it as part of their negotiations. But it's also true that Article 16 should be revoked, because the reality is the Northern Irish Protocol makes sure that Northern Ireland is treated as a colony, effectively as some kind of colonial outpost of the EU. And the Brexit vote was a UK-wide vote, and democratically we have to respect the UK as a whole in relation to that, and the Northern Irish Protocol doesn't do that, and that's Britain's fault. I mean, I want to blame the EU, I want to vote von der Leyen, but actually it's Michael Gove, it's the government that refused to acknowledge the difficulties of this, denied there would be difficulties and didn't sort it out, and they could have done. So it's important that we take ownership of that. It's also important that we recognise that even though the UK should be treated as the UK for the purposes of that discussion, there are people who would say, well, this raises the thorny question of the border. And I agree, the border in Northern Ireland, between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, is contentious and has been for many decades. That's a different question, and I'm sure that it will come up. But the reality is that for Brexit purposes, it was a UK-wide vote and the people of Northern Ireland have been dumped. That's that. The vaccine story, which prompted that von der Leyen intervention in relation to Northern Ireland, is absolutely fascinating. And I just want to stress that the UK would have been held back if it had been in the European Union in terms of vaccinations. But that to one side, don't want to be gloating. The most extraordinary thing that's occurred, apart from the dangerous protectionism, is the way that Macron, von der Leyen and the EU have started to attack or undermine the efficacy of vaccinations in order to justify their inability to secure vaccinations for the peoples of different member states of the EU. My God, that's anti-vaxxing. And I see that von der Leyen is organising a conference on misinformation and how the EU can clamp down on anyone who says anything that's untrue scientifically, and undoubtedly censoriousness will occur. Well, they have done more to undermine vaccination efficacy than anyone this week, and therefore I am glad that we're out. So I'll gloat for a minute. I started off by talking about new people in the House of Lords. One of the new Lord, and I don't often say good things about the House of Lords, so I want to say this. He's a Lord that's been brought in to work for the Ministry of Justice, and I know I can't remember his name. That's hopeless. Anyway, he's basically a barrister, and he's been running all of the discussions around the domestic violence bill. And I've, as you know, sat through all of those discussions. I've been intervening in relation to it. And he actually, yesterday, conducted that scrutiny of the bill at report stage, at committee stage, in a way that was hugely impressive. It made me feel intimidated that I wasn't a lawyer, but I was impressed with the way that he took every single question seriously and every line of the bill seriously. Now, I mention that because there was a discussion on presumption of parental access, because some people are trying to argue effectively that men should not ever be assumed to be have access if they've been accused, even if they've been accused of domestic abuse. And there was this discussion that took place, which I sat in awe of, because it was like being on the Moral Maze again, it genuinely was fantastic. There was Lady Butler Schloss, there was Baroness Meacher, there was all of these law lords, and my God, I felt like I learned a lot, and people changed their mind. But it was nice because I'd previously spoken, apologised for not being a lawyer, said that just as a layperson, and then quite a lot of people afterwards said, well, I'm a layperson too, and you don't have to be a lawyer. And I think that, to its credit, that gave me an insight into the scrutinising aspect of the House of Lords that could be good. Bad bit of story now is this. I know from the clips that I put on social media that when I'm doing discussions on domestic abuse, a lot of people keep saying to me, and I understand this, yeah, but I've got a mate who was being harassed by a bloke who then the police took no notice of, and, she was badly beaten up, or sometimes worse than that, killed. People have had real problems over the years, largely women. We're not allowed to say it's just a women question, by the way, which drives me mad. Largely women. And we know that the problem this bill is trying to solve is that there are instances where women are genuinely at threat, their ex-partners are on the rampage, and no one will believe them. I get it, right? And this bill is trying to solve that. And you can't understand, when you're watching me going on, why that isn't what I focus on. The truth is, this is a piece of legislation in which they've thrown the kitchen sink, in which there are incredibly draconian attacks on civil liberties, in which the emphasis on solving the problem of the victim has almost been hijacked by different interest groups, lobby groups. Every single possible issue that you could associate with coercive control, emotional manipulation has been thrown at this bill. And it is, I think, been a real learning curve for me this week to realise that what might be a well-intentioned piece of legislation that should and could be scrutinised by a scrutinising body is actually becomes a political vehicle in which every hobby horse and every prejudice of the modern era becomes encapsulated by the law, in the law, so that it will become illegal to do things which are at present perfectly legal and should be. And the women that you are worried are not going to not be protected because we've lost focus of them. They're nowhere to be seen because we discuss anything and everything but that. Every council, it's being argued, should now have all these committees full of all these NGOs and everyone. You won't be able to get any support. I mean, you'll have to go through so much bureaucracy, psychotherapists everywhere you look, psychotherapeutic interventions. So I just think it's important to understand that, or rather, I'm sharing what I've understood, which is I can see how a well-intentioned piece of legislation becomes something which we will be fighting off for years to come into the future. But when you see it in the papers, it just says the new bill is going to defend people who are threatened with domestic abuse. So that's my learning for the week. Next week, we are going back to the domestic abuse bill, but there's also going to be the controversy about spy cops, child spies, and again, it's always more complicated than the headline, so I'll report back on that. And then the week after that, would you believe, we've got half term, which I can't wait, and I'm looking forward to. To finish off on Brexit, but also on COVID, at the end of my letter on liberty, and I'm not entirely happy with that, I keep moaning to everyone, it's not quite what I wanted to write, but at the end of it, I talk about how Brexit's gain was sovereignty. But sovereignty isn't just national sovereignty, it also has to have a sense that individuals take control of their lives. And the more and more I hear the COVID regulations just being postponed or extended and so on, the more that you just feel you've lost control. So individual sovereignty is hugely important. And I've just given a compliment to the House of Lords about legislation scrutiny. The truth of the matter is that for all those law lords, for all those civil libertarians who are in there never shutting up, and they don't shut up, every time there's a regulation extension for COVID, they just nod it through. There's just no scrutiny. So when it comes to taking away our personal sovereignty, do not trust the House of Lords. Do trust yourself. We do now have to put the government under some pressure to say the fantastic success of vaccines, to your credit, you can own it, now has to have some results for allowing a certain amount of personal freedom to be restored. And we're asking nicely, but at some point this has got to be something that's demanded forcefully, because to be treated as dependent children who've got no control over their lives is not tolerable any longer. And I think everybody feels that.